Hello everyone, welcome to ENH blog. My name is Swapna Sarit and today we'll discuss on SailPoint IdentityNow's workflows. In current presentation, we'll understand what is workflows and its general terminology. We'll also discuss where we can build our workflows in IdentityNow. And in last, we'll talk about the process to migrate a workflow and some use cases which are demonstrated in the demo video. Workflow. Workflow is nothing but an arrangement of several processes or steps that are completed every time a specific event occurs. Usually, every workflow is initiated by a trigger point. As we understood what a workflow is, let us discuss why SailPoint introduced workflows in IdentityNow. Every operation in SailPoint's IdentityNow follows a defined step and gives you a result, and it is same for every customer in the world. But what if you want to have a different result for the same operation? For example, when your subadmin created one source in the tenant, in a general workflow perspective, you will not aware of the event until unless you log in. But using workflow, you can configure the event and get notification whenever there is a new source got created. It also helps in reducing time. To explain this, consider creation of certification campaign for every event that is happening in your organization can be time consuming. Creating workflow helps your team in focusing on reviewing changes to access, and it also helps to reduce that workload. And finally, it also adds the ability to interoperate with non-managed applications like ITSM tools and messaging services, which ensures your focus is on your business and not in managing identities. Let's talk about the features that SailPoint IdentityNow workflows have. Workflow offers custom functionality for different events. Using this feature, user can define a sequence for a particular action. It also offers broad flexibility, means you can configure a workflow to take very specific action each time it runs. As usual, workflow are also managed by JSON, but you can configure your workflows using both JSON and UI. Let's move to the next slide where we'll know basics of a workflow and how to put them together. Before configuring our first workflow, let us know the terminology which are used. A trigger is an event which tells workflow to execute its steps. We all are familiar with event triggers. However, you cannot use all available event triggers. We'll discuss about the trigger points which can be used in a workflow at a later point in this presentation. Workflow starts with a JSON input delivered by the trigger. As this input moves through the workflow, some steps will add additional JSON to it. This JSON that moves between steps is known as a data flow. Each workflow has an input in JSON format provided by the trigger. This JSON data moves through each step in workflow. When data enters a step, it becomes input. We also have a feature called variable selector, using which we can give reference to any part of the input. This variable selector follows JSON path to select data and pass to the next steps. For example, when there is an identity attribute changes, you want to select new value of that attribute, and for this you can use variable selector. Inline variable allow user to choose a variable from one specific step and use it to execute the current step. This also follows JSON path, but we can enter our values as a text. To explain this, we can consider the example as in a general perspective, user will get email notification when there is an attribute change happens. But using inline variable, we can send an email notification to the respective manager as well. The workflow follows a defined path chronologically till end is called steps. This includes trigger, actions and operators. Let's move to the next slide where we have more about the steps. As mentioned, starting from trigger to end step, all considered as a steps. Coming to trigger, we all know it determines when a workflow will start. Every workflow can only have one trigger point. It is a snippet of workflow where we can see several blocks with different names. Let's understand them. Actions are nothing but the task performed outside of the workflow, means fetching data from previous step or sending email to target recipient. Every workflow must have at least one action button as well. Operators directs the data flow in any workflow. In general, it makes conditional choice such as true or false and then select data flow path based on the result. End steps are also considered as an operator. User with access will have three different platforms to build a workflow, that is template, visual builder and JSON. Coming to template, SailPoint have some pre-designed workflow as template. We can select a template as per our requirement and use it. It is also configurable as we can do the needful changes and modify variables to meet the requirement. Visual Builder offers a plain canvas to configure our own workflow. We can select desired trigger, operators and action from the available list and can use the inline variables. It also have features to use dynamic and static variables and can also use JSON path for a particular variable. User can build a workflow manually by using JSON. You can select and download JSON file from a template or previously built workflow, edit the file and upload it. User must meet JSON workflow requirements while working with workflow in JSON. When we choose to work with Visual Builder, we are building a workflow from scratch. Means we need to select steps as per our own logic, but how to start and from where. First, need to provide a unique name and description and select a trigger as per our logic. It may require some additional step known as trigger filter. Trigger filter narrows down the circumstance and get input to the trigger as per the filter. Now select Action tab from the list and draw a connection string from Trigger tab to Action tab. In Action tab, you will get option to select variable. You can do it either by variable selector or inline variable. Now we need to make sure our data flows in correct direction, so need to draw a connection string from trigger to action. Place some operators and select values or provide the condition based on which data flow will be decided and proceed with connecting action tab to operators. If our logic required, we can have more operators and action in our workflow. Now save and test your workflow. If your workflow have errors, it will show you to the bottom of your workspace. You can save a workflow with error but cannot test it. To test, you need to resolve them first. Let's have a look from the other side of workflow to know how it works. When we started talking on workflow, we continuously came across one word, JSON. Why JSON? We'll have answer to this question by end of this blog. But it is noted that whenever we build a workflow, it converts into JSON in the backend. This JSON object must have a metadata which will have unique name and description. Based on steps we add in Visual Builder, JSON object will be added to specific place. This displayed schema is a default schema of a workflow. As we understood what is workflow and how it works in IdentityNow, let's have a close look on triggers. A trigger is the event that tells workflow to start. It is the only starting point for a workflow and also provides the initial input. All workflow must have one trigger. Some template need integration with SaaS management, and your workflow will be triggered by a third-party trigger called external trigger. For external trigger, user cannot use variable selector, but we can use trigger filter to narrow down the circumstance of our workflow. Some example on available triggers are identity changes, outlier detected, provisioning completed, and scheduled search. Triggers can be external, event-based, and time-based. Event trigger service is IdentityNow service which generates events on the event stream. For example, when an identity is created, deleted, or an attribute changes. If we go more detail, then certification campaign also an event, and aggregation, completion, or started are also an events. Fire forward type triggers are the one-way communication with ETS subscribers. Its sole purpose is to forward the event to the subscribing services. Most workflow triggers are fire and forget type. For example, identity created, deleted, provisioning completed, aggregation completed, or campaign activated. Let's talk about each of the available trigger point in SailPoint's IdentityNow workflow. When there is a change in identity level, such as identity created, deleted, or value changed for an attribute, then we can use identity triggers. Source triggers can be used to design workflow to achieve some specific result for operations like create, update, or delete. Accounts trigger can be used for creating workflow based on the event such as account disablement or when account aggregation starts and completes. Currently, IdentityNow is capable of sending email alert for VA, but using virtual appliance trigger, we can create some new workflows. Provision completed event trigger will initiate a workflow when a provision operation is completed. A new workflow can be created to do operations such as access review or similar by saved search query event trigger. We also have event triggers for access request decision and certification campaign related operation such as campaign activated, generated, and sign up as well. Let's talk about operators. Operators allow you to make a comparison between values and based on the result of that comparison, choose a new path for your workflow to follow. It performs the conditional operation like true, false, compare string, numbers as well. This is also capable of doing operations in a loop. End steps are also a part of operators, whether it is a failure or success, and it is required to have in your workflow. Example includes comparison, loop, success, failure step, compare string, compare number, end step for success or failure. Workflow also supports the ability to and or and not operator when comparing values in a comparator step. These are the list of operators that is available in SailPoint's IdentityNow workflows. Action. Action is the most important block of a workflow which ensures the correct flow of data. And every action block requires an input, whether it be a variable from the previous block or a static one. Each action contains a period of time. If that fails, the whole workflow will fail. Here, you can use inline variables to modify your action steps more specifically. Here is the list of actions which can be included in a workflow. Next, we'll discuss on inline variables and JSON path and its syntax. Before moving to there, let's have answer to the question why JSON. As per the architecture, for every IdentityNow operation, SailPoint have dedicated and independent microservice which use REST API to receive and transfer the data. While working with REST API, we can choose other language format as HTML, XML, but JSON helps to set up a REST API with CRUD operation very fast, and JSON is the most popular way to pack information in the body of a HTTP request or response. It is also easy to modify. Giving any string input while choosing a variable is known as inline variable. We need to follow JSON path format while giving inline variables. As per format, the variable must be inside double curly braces. So, in order to work with inline variable, we need to know JSON path. Let's move to the next slide to see what is it and how it works. JSON path expression always refers to a JSON structure where we select any variable using selector. Internally, it converts to a JSON path. It usually starts from $, which is considered as the root, and ends with the object which will be used as a final variable. JSON path follows JVM implementation or Java port of Stephen Guzner JSON path implementation, which makes JSON document readable. This is an example of a JSON path and its result. In this snippet, we have detailed of an identity like first name, last name, street address, phone numbers, but I only want to pass street address to the next step. So for that one, the JSON path should be $.address.street address. The next contains a detailed note of a syntax for a regular JSON path. This is an example of JSON path to explain the syntax in a better fashion. The $sign is the root object, the $sign is the current object name, dot or square braces are child operator or subscript operators. If we are using or seeing any kind of question mark with parenthesis, it is used to filter an expression, and if we are using single parenthesis, that can be used for script expression. It is advisable to test your workflow before you enabling the same for your tenant. While testing your workflow, the data you are passing is entirety, means it will require real-time data and also give you real-time output. If your workflow has validation errors, those must be resolved before you can test your workflow. If your workflow test succeed, you can enable your workflow from the list of workflows. If your test fails, the step the workflow failed on is highlighted and an error is displayed. If your workflow error was related to test input, select Start New Test to edit your test input and run your test again. If your workflow error is related to a step configuration, select the X icon to go back to the workflow builder and keep working. It is advisable to prepare a set of dummy data like identity, end application, and access to prevent real-time changes to access of any identity. We have some key sections to work on to start with simulated workflow test. First, specify the workflow input. Every workflow has its own set of data as an input. It is JSON object which guides you what structure you require in future. You need to have real-time data in order to execute your workflow because the ID mentioned in the input data never exists in your environment. Second, create dummy data or dummy identity data. You can create a simple delimited file-based source for your truth source and proceed with the basic configuration like identity profile, attribute mapping, and provisioning policy. Third, creating other system accounts. It depends upon what event trigger you are selecting and what functionality you include in your workflow. Make sure that no uncorrelated data is present. Lastly, configure other test data. This section includes to create access profile, roles, and adding entitlement to users. As we are familiar with how to create test data, let's understand some best practice to manage test data. Keeping security as a primary focus, these are the best practice in managing your test data. Perform workflow test in a sandbox environment. Minimize false data in your system by creating only the accounts and necessary access for your test cases. Having this test data in a place will provide a safer way to test your workflow without disrupting your enterprise users' necessary business access. Minimal access to identity means avoid granting high security entitlement to test identities and accounts. Outside of testing cycle, disable or delete the false identities and accounts in adherence to good security practice. Building workflow in a visual builder helps in finding error for each step. Each error should have resolved before testing and each workflow must be tested after saving the changes. To test your workflow, user needs to provide a JSON input and can track where your data flow fails. As per best practice, we must build and test our workflow in Sandbox. But how to migrate a workflow from Sandbox to production environment? SailPoint made it easy by offering building workflow from JSON. Post successful test of any workflow, we can download the script by clicking download icon. It will be downloaded and saved with a JSON extension. Now we need to log into our production environment and click on New Workflow and select Start with a JSON file. We'll land on a new dashboard where we'll upload previously downloaded JSON file and give name, description and save. Your workflow will be ready. Or we also have a secondary way which is spconfig API. We can export and import workflows using spconfig APIs available by Beta API in SailPoint IdentityNow. As we understood key blocks of a workflow, how to build a workflow and test a workflow as well, here are some use cases we can try ourselves. I will build and demonstrate a workflow based on some use cases which will help you to build remaining. See you in next video. Please drop your questions in the comment section. Thank you.